When I look back, my childhood is little more than a haze, a smudged blur of half-forgotten moments. It's not that those years were marred by some unspeakable misery. No, it's the price I pay for the reckless liberties I took later, drowning memory in a fog of hash and late-night dissections during my medical studies. Sentimentality never appealed to me, either. I've no urge to sift through dusty boxes of fading photographs or unravel the peculiar knots of childhood fixations. The past, for the most part, is a dim and shifting shadow. But there's one memory that has refused to fade, a jagged shard lodged in the fabric of my mind. A dark and restless episode, as vivid now as it was then. I feel compelled to capture it here, as though setting it down might exorcise its grip. My parents were not wealthy, but they were just. Everything was shared with meticulous fairness. If my sister Sophie received a treat, I could expect one of equal value. Birthdays and Christmases were choreographed to ensure balance. Yet, there was one instance when fairness faltered, and Sophie received a gift far grander than my own. While I was assembling a mundane model racetrack, Sophie had been given a dollhouse, an enormous Gothic monstrosity of wood and glass. It was no ordinary toy. My parents had stumbled upon it at a car boot sale, its true worth unknown to the seller who parted with it for a mere £5. At 10 years old, I didn't grasp its significance, but I was quietly entranced. Though I pretended indifference, the house captivated me. It stood 2 stories tall, its 10 rooms a labyrinth of intricate detail. The facade bristled with arches, gables, and turreted chimney stacks. Inside, tiny carpets stretched across floors, and the wallpaper bore miniature woodblock patterns. But it was the objects within truly mesmerized me. A china dinner service with cutlery no larger than grains of rice. Tiny, framed paintings that seemed to hold real brushstrokes. And in the fireplaces, hand-carved logs, each a perfect replica of its life-sized counterpart. Among these treasures, one item particularly seized my imagination, a set of miniature hunting shotguns, exquisitely crafted, complete with tiny break-action mechanisms. My fascination grew in secret. While Sophie was away at dance classes, I would creep into her room, slide open the dollhouse's doors, and marvel at its hidden wonders. Each exploration uncovered new delights: cookware, clothing, even a delicate metal and wood steam engine with a brass bulb. One evening, convinced it could work, I returned with water and a candle, ready to test my theory. But the tiny engine was gone. Sophie, meanwhile, became consumed by the dollhouse. Her evenings were no longer spent with the family in front of the television. She bolted her food at dinner, excusing herself early to retreat into her private world. At first, my parents were indulgent. After all, it was harmless, wasn't it? Just a child's innocent fascination. But then, one Sunday evening, the fragile calm of our home shattered. From the room next to mine came the sound of raised voices, an argument, sharp and startling. Sophie's cries pierced the night, her voice frantic and thick with tears. It wasn't me. She wailed, her words strangled in a fit of sobbing. Something had gone terribly wrong. I heard them, first low, urgent whispers drifting up from below. The kind of tones that pricked the skin and quickened the heart without ever needing words. Moments later, Sophie's door banged open, and she came hurtling into my room, a pale blur of frantic limbs. She threw herself onto my bed, clutching at me with cold, damp hands, her small frame racked with sobs. "Daddy said I hurt Swimmy," she gasped between hiccuping cries, her voice a thin, shuddering wail. Swimmy, the family goldfish. He'd been lazily circling his bowl on the dining room sideboard for years, his tiny world of glass and water uninterrupted. Until now. While Sophie buried her face in my sheets, streaking them with tears and mucus, the adults shuffled in. Their expressions were an unsettling mix of guilt and something darker, something wary. My father, his voice soft but strained, broke the heavy silence. "All right, kids. Let's calm down," he said, though only Sophie was in hysterics. My mother hesitated, then tried to soothe. "Oh, Sophie, maybe we acted a little hastily." I sat up, the forgotten book in my lap slipping to the floor. "What's going on?" I asked, my confusion growing alongside a creeping unease. A glance passed between my parents, a fleeting, wordless exchange that made my stomach twist. Then my father sat down on the edge of the bed, his eyes tired but watchful. "Swimmy's gone to fish heaven," he said gently. "But don't worry, we'll get another pet soon, maybe even a cat." His attempt at reassurance rang hollow. His words were light, but his eyes betrayed a deeper unease, as though he were tiptoeing around the edges of something unspeakable. Mother eased Sophie off the bed, guiding her downstairs with promises of hot cocoa and comforting words. I stayed behind, the silence in their wake heavy and oppressive. It wasn't until later that night, piecing together the fragments of their hushed conversations, that the full grotesque picture emerged. They had found Swimmy lifeless in his bowl, water-clouded and still. But it wasn't just death that had taken him, it was something deliberate. His small body had been violated, something crucial removed. A trail of water droplets led them from the dining room, up the stairs, and into Sophie's room. They searched everywhere, finally turning to her beloved dollhouse. Inside one of the meticulously crafted drawers on the first floor, they found it, Swimmy's tiny, slimy heart. Perfectly excised, resting like some macabre treasure in that miniature space. How did she even know? I heard my father murmur later, his voice low and tremulous. How could she dissect it so accurately? My mother's voice was sharper, yet quivering. "Always with that house," she said. "Always talking to herself, those voices she hears. She's just being creative, right? Isn't that what we told ourselves?" But now, their whispers descended into fretful murmurs, half suggestions of therapists and second opinions, but neither willing to make a decision. The atmosphere in the house shifted that night, growing thick with an unspoken dread. That was the first time my life brushed against something beyond explanation, the first thread unraveling from the safe fabric of childhood. When I finally drifted off to sleep, the unease followed me. My dreams were vivid, almost too real. I stood at the foot of a grand, crumbling Victorian mansion, its dark windows staring down like empty eyes. It was night, and the air was thick with fog, but I knew this place. It was the life-sized replica of Sophie's dollhouse, brought to menacing, shadowy life. The door creaked open under my hand, and I stepped inside. My child's curiosity burned hot as I ran from room to room, searching. The dollhouse's strange allure had followed me here. Somewhere hidden within these walls, I knew I would find the miniature hunting shotguns. And maybe, just maybe, something more. I wanted to play. I skidded to a halt in the dining room, but the air hit me first. A sharp, briny scent, thick with the tang of the seaside, curled around me, unexpected and wrong. It pulled me from the trance of the dream, a chilling realization creeping in. I'd never smelled anything in a dream before. Scanning the room, my eyes fell on the tall pine sideboard. One of its drawers was slightly ajar, hanging open just enough to expose a sliver of darkness. From that narrow gap, gallons of black, brackish water gushed forth, pooling and soaking into the carpet. It spilled endlessly, a torrent of decay and rot, each wave filling the room with the reek of stagnant pond muck. I stepped forward, the sense of wrongness clawing at my gut. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but I was drawn closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the drawer. With a hesitant pull, I slid it fully open. Inside was a grotesque, gelatinous mass. It quivered weightly, a bloated, translucent thing that pulsed and throbbed as though alive. As I stared, another sickening slosh of foul water surged out, splattering the carpet. The sight was monstrous, yet a strange, dreamlike calm settled over me. This was not a nightmare of panic, but of cold, creeping dread. I left the dining room, its horrors unexamined further, and continued my search. Somewhere in this warped dream world, the shotguns I sought were hidden. Room after room passed, each steeped in the same uneasy silence, until finally I reached the last, the upstairs corner bedroom. There stood Sophie. Her small frame was draped in a white nightgown, and she stood by the large oval mirror in the corner. She faced away from me, unmoving. The mirror's surface, dark and dull, seemed to drink in the dim light. I called her name, but she gave no response. Slowly, her hand rose, pale and trembling, to grasp the mirror's edge. She swung it on its axis, revealing the rough, unfinished wood of its back. The grain swelled unnaturally, the patterns within twisting and writhing as though alive. Sophie's fingers trembled as she traced one shaking line across the wood. Splinters pierced her skin, drawing dark, sluggish blood that smeared across the surface. I wanted to move, to help her, but I was frozen, paralyzed in the doorway. My heart pounded in my chest as Sophie, now visibly in distress, continued her macabre task. Her bloodied finger traced shapes on the wood, unfamiliar and angular. They weren't words, not any language I knew. When she finished, she slumped to the floor in a heap. In that instant, the paralysis lifted. I rushed forward, but before I could reach her, I woke, my heart racing in the dark. It was a disturbing dream, certainly, but I'd had vivid nightmares before. I dismissed it as just another product of an overactive imagination. That is, until a few days later. With Sophie at dance class, I found myself alone with her dollhouse. My fingers moved almost on their own as I explored its tiny, intricate rooms. In the upstairs corner room, my gaze fell on the little oval mirror. It was made of polished glass, reflecting my wide eyes as I peered into the miniature world. On a whim, I reached inside and gently flipped the mirror. My breath caught as the back came into view. The wood was stained a dry, sickly brown, and etched into its surface was a diagram, a perfect, insect-sized replica of the shape Sophie had traced in my dream. The design was impossibly small, its lines sharp and precise. At first glance, it wasn't ugly. The symmetry and meticulous craftsmanship were almost beautiful. But as I stared, a sickening wave of revulsion washed over me. The longer I looked, the more the symbol seemed to radiate a sense of decay and corruption. The air grew heavy with the phantom stench of damp earth and rot. My ears buzzed, and a cold, graveyard chill seeped into my bones. I tore my gaze away, my head pounding, and hastily copied the diagram into my notepad. As soon as the sketch was complete, I flipped the mirror back, silencing the oppressive hum that had wrapped around me. That evening, I showed the drawing to Sophie, recounting the strange dream in as much detail as I dared. She barely glanced at the notepad, her disinterest unsettling. If she had any connection to Swimi's grisly fate, or to the uncanny symbols, she gave no sign. The next day, when I returned from school, something was different. The air in the house was tense, and Mother's expression was tight, her knuckles pale as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. Something was coming. She explained, still breathless, that she had been locked in a frantic battle with a bat tangled in Sophie's bedroom curtains. Living near the woods, bats were no strangers to our home, flitting like shadows at dusk. But Sophie, pale and wide-eyed, clearly wasn't keen on sharing her room with one. "I think I chased it out," Mother assured us, her voice unsteady. "Or maybe it's gone to ground." I didn't know what that meant at the time. Her words stirred no alarm, their oddness quickly buried under the distraction of breaded fish fingers, a meal both Sophie and I adored. The bat and its unsettling presence dissolved into the mundane comforts of dinner, but my mind wasn't so quick to let it go. That night, the dream returned. Once more, I stood before Sophie's dollhouse, now towering in full size, every intricate detail scaled to grotesque realism. Stone steps loomed before me, slick with dew. Driven by the same strange compulsion, I rushed inside, heart hammering, desperate for the elusive shotguns. The house greeted me with silence, but not stillness. In the parlor, a horrifying sight awaited. A pale wooden spear jutted from the floorboards before the fireplace. It was slick with a gelatinous substance, thick orbs of it sliding down the wood in a nauseating rhythm. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, my instincts screaming to stay away. Skirting the edge of the room, I moved deeper into the house. Unlike before, this dream felt different, heavier, more aware. Each step was weighed down by an oppressive dread, and Sophie. Sophie was everywhere. In every room, she stood in her nightgown, her back turned to me, hair hanging like a veil over her face. She moved without sound, drifting from room to room as if guided by an unseen force. No matter how fast I tried to approach, I could never reach her. Her presence was haunting, silent, and wrong. As I ascended the stairs to the second floor, a sound filled the air, a deep, rhythmic thump, the beating of massive wings. I froze as a scratching noise followed, nails or claws raking across the roof. Loose tiles dislodged, clattering to the ground outside. The house felt under siege, the atmosphere thick with an almost palpable fear. Desperation took hold. I needed the shotguns, now not for play, but for defense. My search grew frantic. Finally, in the last bedroom at the end of the corridor, I found them, two gleaming double-barreled shotguns leaning against the oval mirror. I moved toward them, but my stomach churned as I caught sight of the mirror. From its polished surface, that sickening, intricate symbol burned into my vision, the same pattern from before. Its dark geometry seemed to twist and pulse, radiating a malicious energy. My head buzzed, nausea rolling over me in waves. I threw an arm over my eyes, shielding myself from its malignant influence, and stumbled forward. The air thickened into an invisible sludge, resisting every movement. Each breath came labored, my chest heavy, as though the house itself sought to trap me. With a final strained lunge, I seized the shotguns and turned toward the window. I flung it open, wrenching the shutters aside, only to find my view obscured. A dark leathery barrier pressed against the glass, suffocating the room in shadow. It shifted, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just a blockage, it was a wing. Vast and sinewy, it flexed slightly, its surface glistening like oil-slicked leather. Terror surged through me. Stumbling back, I raised the shotgun to my shoulder, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the action. I aimed at the window, heart pounding, and pulled the trigger. An ear-splitting explosion rocked the dream. The sound of shattering glass jolted me awake. I shot upright in bed, drenched in cold sweat, my ears ringing from the phantom blast. But the sound was no dream. From across the hall, a crash echoed, followed by the sharp, unmistakable crack of breaking glass. My heart leapt into my throat. Sophie's room. Mother and father's panicked footsteps thundered down the hallway. They flung Sophie's door open, gasping in horror. Father barked at me to stay put, his face pale and strained, before slamming my door shut and holding it firm against my attempts to follow. Through the thin walls, I heard them moving about frantically. Something terrible had happened, and whatever it was, it had come from outside. I stumbled to my own window, my hands shaking as I pulled back the curtain, dreading what I might see. I watched from my window as Mother hurried to the car, a bundle in her arms swaddled in a blood-specked blanket. Her silhouette was pale in the streetlight's glow, trembling as she sped away, the wheels shrieking on the wet pavement. She was rushing Sophie to the hospital. The moment Father released the pressure on my door, I bolted. I didn't need to be told where to go, I already knew. Wordlessly, I led him to Sophie's room and pointed at the dollhouse. Specifically, to the spot in front of the tiny fireplace in the foyer. My throat tightened as I recalled the nightmarish scene, the way that miniature world mirrored something dark and hungry, something alive. Father said nothing, but his expression was grim. He wasn't one for superstition, but he could see the truth in my wide, pleading eyes. Without hesitation, he fetched a heavy iron pipe from the garage and returned to the dollhouse. What followed was a methodical, almost ritualistic destruction. Blow after blow reduced the intricate structure to splinters. The carefully carved turrets and delicate arches shattered into meaningless debris. He worked silently, his breath heavy, and when it was done, he scooped every fragment into a sack. Together, we carried it outside. In the backyard, beneath a sullen sky, Father built a towering bonfire. The flames roared to life, devouring the dollhouse piece by piece. The fire burned green, oily smoke curling into the night air. It hissed and sputtered, the sound like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. Whatever secrets the dollhouse held its origin, its purpose, were lost in that blaze. There were no manufacturer's marks, no clues left behind. Only the greasy, flickering flames and the faint smell of burnt varnish and fabric. I watched as the final scraps of chintzy miniature wallpaper curled and blackened, and somewhere deep in the fire, something hissed like a dying breath. But what haunted me most was the image burned into my memory. Sophie's glass eye, its unnervingly lifelike sheen catching the firelight. It lay impaled on a tiny toothpick in that dream, positioned perfectly in the foyer of the dollhouse, just like in my vision. The other grotesque fragments of that nightmare lingered in the periphery of my mind, but the eye, it felt like a message, a threat. To this day, Sophie will tell you she lost her eye at the age of 6, the result of a freak accident involving a malfunctioning gas heater in her bedroom. She speaks of it with calm detachment, as if she doesn't even miss it, but I know better. She was too young to remember properly, too young to piece together the sinister puzzle. She screamed when she returned from the hospital and found the ashes of her beloved dollhouse. For days, her grief echoed through the halls. We never mentioned the fire around her again. We let her believe Father had acted out of anger or maybe grief. But deep down, we knew it had been an act of necessity, a purging. Even now, years later, Sophie avoids that old bedroom. She makes excuses whenever we visit our parents' house, her gaze flickering toward the faint scorch marks still visible around the window frame. She's never bought a dollhouse for her own daughter, nor any miniature toys. It's as if some unspoken instinct warns her away from such things. And none of us, have ever set foot at a car boot sale again.